When I was born in 1867, my parents registered me as Maria Salomea Sklodowska, but I am now better known as Marie Curie. I was their last child, one of 5, born at the Freda Street boarding school, where my mother was principal. The apartment we lived in was part of my mother's salary. We lived in Warsaw, Poland, which was at that time occupied by the Russians. My mother was a musician and my father was a mathematician who had lost his job as a teacher. As a result, we were poor and had to rent out rooms to make enough money. My parents loved their country and wanted it to be free from occupation. When I was 12 years old, my mother died tuberculosis, a nasty disease that affected the lungs and other organs of the body. There was no cure, and as I watched her slowly die, I started to think about whether I could do anything to help other people with the same illness. I had a cousin who ran the Museum of Industry and Agriculture in Warsaw, and he encouraged my interest in science. In Poland, access to university science education was available only to men. Instead, women had a secret, illegal organization, a floating university, which was a network of people who taught each other. We moved from one house to another and shared our knowledge. My cousin let me do some practical scientific training and experiments at the museum, but to progress any further, it was necessary to go to another country and study there. This was an ambition, shared with my sister Bronislava. Others might have called it a dream, but we found a way to make it really happen. Actually, it was quite a simple plan. I would stay in Poland and work while Bronislava would study abroad, supported by the money I was earning. When she had finished her education and had found a job, it would be my turn to study while she supported me. We put the first part of our plan into action when Bronislava left Poland to study in Paris. For my first job, I lived with a lawyer's family in Krakow, teaching the children, and then I went to another family in Ciechane, where I stayed for 2 years. I met the son of the family and we fell in love. We wanted to get married, but I was a poor girl and his family disapproved of me, so we had to break up. I was unhappy after this and needed to get away, and I moved to Sopot, in the north of Poland. Here, I lived with yet another family for a year, working by day and studying by night. In the meantime, my sister had got married and was now in a position where she could help me financially. She invited me to come and stay with her, so at the age of 24, I went to Paris. I stayed with Bronislava for a while and then rented a little room of my own, right at the top of a house. It wasn't comfortable or warm, but I felt a sense of freedom that I had never had before. I managed to become a student at the Sorbonne University, and I would study during the day and work as a tutor in the evening. I got my master's degree in physics, and then a year later I also got a degree in mathematics. Living in a foreign country wasn't easy, especially studying in a foreign language, but I was determined to succeed. Despite my sister's help, I had very little money and sometimes I survived on just bread and tea, with the result that I was often unwell. However, I was achieving my ambition, and that was more important to me than my health. From the beginning, I was interested in magnetism, the force that makes two objects pull towards or away from each other. In 1894, I was offered a job studying the energy in iron ore to see what magnetic powers it had, and needed a laboratory to work in. A friend introduced me to a quiet, rather shy man, another scientist, who had the kind of space I needed. He encouraged me and soon we felt a special connection of our own, for magnetism also applies to people. This kind man was, of course, Pierre Curie, who was to become my husband. At the time, he was an instructor at the School of Physics and Chemistry, and in 1900 became professor of general physics at the Sorbonne. My task was to try to isolate radioactive material in the iron ore. This involved melting iron in a huge container. It was hard work and the conditions were less than perfect, as I was either outside or in a rough kind of shed. I didn't know it at the time, but this was fortunate as the melting iron gave off a poisonous gas that probably would have done me a lot of harm if I had been indoors. Much later, in the 1930s, it was also discovered that people exposed to radiation were at risk of developing anemia, a disease of the blood, and bone cancer. Pierre and I would spend endless hours discussing our research, and our friendship became more and more serious as time passed. We decided to get engaged and then we got married in 1895. I felt incredibly lucky. Not only had I found a good man to share my home life with, but I also had someone who shared my love of science. I was no longer alone. 2 years later, I got my doctorate in physics. I was the first woman in France to do this. And then a second special event happened when our daughter Irena was born in the same year. In the meantime, with our joint energy and ideas, we were taking science into completely new areas. I was interested in the work of Henri Becquerel, a scientist at the French Academy of Sciences, on a heavy white metal called uranium. He discovered that uranium gave off rays that were similar to, but weaker than the X-rays Wilhelm Röntgen, a German scientist, had just discovered. Continuing Becquerel's research, I found that rays from the uranium stayed the same no matter what condition or form the metal was in. To me, this meant only one thing: that the rays had come from the atomic structure of the uranium. And that meant that we had discovered what I called radioactivity. I saw radioactivity as being an amazing gift from nature. We needed to capture its power and control it. Our studies built on this aim through further research. The mineral we now started to study, called pitchblende, may not sound very exciting, but what we found would change the future. We discovered two new radioactive elements, one that I called polonium after my beloved Poland and the other, radium. This was truly magical material, but what could we do with it? We continued experimenting and found that it was very effective on human skin problems. For example, radium could burn off cancers. Doctors started using it as a treatment and it quickly became known as Curie therapy. I continued working with my husband and we found out how to isolate pure radium. In 1903, this earned us and Becquerel a Nobel Prize. We used the money to pay for more research and to support poor science students who otherwise would not have been able to continue their studies. With the birth of our second daughter, Eve, in 1904, it looked as if we could successfully combine both our family and professional lives. Then, in 1906, the unthinkable happened. Pierre accidentally stepped in front of a horse and was killed. I was now a single mother with 2 children. I was heartbroken and didn't know how I was going to continue without him. The Sorbonne offered me my husband's position at the university, making me the first ever woman professor there. I continued doing Pierre's work and my own, but was ignored by the French Science Academy. I had the feeling that they did not like the fact that I was both female and Polish. These two things seemed more important to them than the scientific discoveries I made. In addition, people in the scientific community talked about me, which I'm sure also harmed my professional reputation. For a long time after Pierre's death, I was in shock and I tried to balance work and family life. Through my work, I got to know Paul Langevin, who had been a student of Pierre's. In my darkest days after Pierre's death, his support helped me to get through and we gradually became friends. His marriage was in difficulty and in 1910 it ended. People in the scientific community knew about our friendship and blamed me for the breakup. It was surprising that this happened in Paris, where people were not usually blamed for problems in their personal lives. My personal life may have affected how seriously my work was seen by some people at home in France, but it didn't stop me from receiving a second Nobel Prize in 1911. This time it was for chemistry, for having measured the atomic weight of radium. I was the first person to have been given the Nobel Prize twice. My work on radioactivity and X-rays continued, and during the First World War we saw the terrible effects the bombing and shooting were having on French and British soldiers. With my daughter Erin, I set up X-ray vans that could travel round to all the field hospitals, the temporary hospitals that were near where soldiers were fighting, and we trained 150 radiographers to use them to assess serious injuries. The vans soon got their own name, Little Curies. After the war, recognition for my work came from the USA and I started traveling widely to encourage other scientists. It was very important to try and get as many people as possible to continue making advances with radiotherapy treatments. The new technology could cure illness, help reduce pain and suffering, and extend people's lives. We had already set up the Radium Institute in Paris in 1919, and in 1925 my sister Bronislava opened another branch in Warsaw, becoming its director. My daughter, Elrena, now also a scientist, won the Nobel Prize in 1935 for inventing artificial radioactivity. It was an achievement that her father would have been proud of. However, I had been working all my adult life with dangerous radioactive materials, so it was not surprising when in 1934 I became seriously unwell. I was diagnosed with the type of anemia that can be caused by long-term exposure to radiation, and at the age of 66, I died. In the course of my life I had been a sister, wife, mother, student, scientist, teacher and technical specialist, as well I working in managerial roles. I had done many things that had never been done before by a woman, and I considered my life more than worthwhile.